Dumb and stupid watercolor hacks that I wish I had known when first starting watercolor, or a lot earlier than when I actually learned them. Next, let's talk about staining strength. So staining strength is easy to actually test compared to granulation. Basically, you put your watercolor paper, your watercolor paint on a strip of paper, just kind of swatch it on the piece of paper, let it completely dry, and then take a wet brush with just clear water and try and lift the color up. I actually have created, and I teach you how to do it in the course that I created, but I have created little cards for every single one of my paints, testing staining ability, mixability, basically transparency, granulation. I have all the specifics done in little cards to help me really gauge that particular thing, and I have all of them in here. I share these cards with you in the course so you can see these as well. But it's really nice to know staining, and I really wish people had told me this earlier, but staining strength is an incredible ally, I guess is the best way to put it, when you are trying to create underpainting. So if a paint is very staining and you want to build colors up in a watercolor painting and create colors that are more engaging and more richer and vibrant, but you want to build them up through glazing, staining colors are the way to go, because staining colors are not going to lift when you paint over them. So have you ever been painting with watercolor and you basically paint a color over another color, and then all of a sudden you start seeing that color lifting up and the two colors are not mixing well and they're actually becoming lighter, and you're like, oh no, I just ruined my painting because it looks like the color underneath is lifting up and it's leaving these white streaks on my paper, and what do I do? That's because you laid down a non-staining color and that color is actually lifting up while you're trying to paint over top of it. Even if it's dry, that color is going to lift up. So staining colors are really good for basically laying out where shadows would be or things that you want to build up to darker colors. However, you cannot erase them. So if you make a mistake with a staining color, you cannot erase it. It's going to stay there. It's not forgiving. It's there. So non-staining colors are really nice if you're trying to test out colors and colors that you might think about erasing later on. So staining strength is really good to keep in mind when you're thinking about glazing or building up a watercolor painting, and basically make colors deeper or richer, or even combining two different colors to create kind of a different tone or hue within a painting, especially when you're trying to show light streaks or something like that. Glazing on top of staining colors is the way to go. If you want something a little bit more forgiving when you're playing around with new colors or playing around with new techniques, non-staining colors are a lot more forgiving and will help you in that process. Next, let's talk about pigments. So you might have heard the term pure colors or pure watercolors. Pure watercolors basically mean that those particular colors only have one pigment to them. What is good about having a specific watercolor with only one pigment? And how do you tell what pigment that particular watercolor is? And I'm looking at this to see if it has a pigment number on it. So this one has two. I want to show you one that only has one to it. That's easy to read. Here we go. Okay, so this is Cobalt Turquoise Light. And on the back of Winsor & Newton's, I think Schmincke has theirs on the side. Yeah, they do. They have theirs on the side, so it's right here. Daniel Smith has theirs on the side as well, right here. Holden has theirs on the side. And Winsor Newton has theirs on the back. But basically this pigment, it says PG 50. Okay, so that means pigment green 50 is used in this particular color. What's nice about using colors that only have one pigment is that when you mix them with, let's say, other colors, I feel like I'm a little bit out of focus. Yep, I am. When you mix them with other colors that are just one pigment, you're just mixing two pigments together, and you're less likely to get, let's say, a reaction between the two pigments. That is one reason why a lot of people like pure pigment colors, because they're actually more predictable. However, if you have colors, and I do, that have two or even more pigments, such as my shell pink and my cadmium orange light, those both have two. Shell pink might have more than that, it might have three. Those particular colors, since they have more pigments inside of them, sometimes when they mix with other pigmented colors, especially when you're, let's say, in our brain, if we're mixing two people, think about going to a party and you have two people who are hanging out together, there's less likely to be a fight. If you have two and one person, you might get into a fight, but you might not, into a discussion or something like that. But if you have three and they're all coming together, you are more likely to get into a fight / discussion where you don't necessarily agree with one another's beliefs or that type of thing. So it's something to keep in mind when you're dealing with watercolors that have multiple pigments. They are less predictable than those that have only one pigment to them. They are more predictable because, especially when you're only working with one color that has one pigment and one color that has one pigment. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. Having more pigments, I want to say this very straightly, having more pigments to a watercolor doesn't mean that's a bad watercolor. I actually have quite a few of my colors in my watercolor palette that have two or even more pigments to them. It's just something I need to keep in the back of my head, that these colors might not be as predictable, especially if I am working on a painting and I'm not used to using, let's say, a new color. It's good to keep kind of in mind that that particular color might not mesh well with the other color that I'm working with, and test it out and kind of play around with it before I commit to using it in a watercolor painting, and then go, crud, I just messed up my whole painting, and it's because I didn't understand that this particular paint wouldn't mesh well with this other one. So that's just something to keep in mind. Next, let's talk about mixability. And when I talk about mixability, I'm not going to be talking about two colors and how they mix together. I'm basically going to be talking about how colors do in wet scenarios. So I'm sure that you have watched watercolor videos and you have seen people lay down this beautiful, well, I shouldn't say that. People lay down this wet layer of water on their paper, and then they take a particular color, and then they just dab their little brush on the wet watercolor, wet paper, I should say, and then the color just explodes out. And then you try and replicate that on your own at home. I used to do this all the time when I first started watercolor. I was like, why won't my colors explode out and look beautiful? Well, it's because some colors, and I like to call my colors surfers or sinkers. Some of my watercolor paints, just because of how they are made up and their pigment and basically the actual properties of the paint, some of them will surf out and basically fly across the paper when they are in a wet environment. One particular color that is great at this is Indian yellow. So if you are looking to do more wet on wet loose, where you have almost no freaking control over your watercolors, these particular colors are really, really good for doing that. And an easy way to test that is just put down a sheen of water on your paper, and then just take your paint and stick it basically in the corner of that. And if it shoots out, then it is definitely a surfer. If it just sinks and kind of just stays, it kind of goes out a little bit, but then it just kind of stays on the paper. I call those sinkers. Basically, they are not going to move when you put them down. Shell pink is a really good paint that I think about with this. This particular color is really, really good for just wherever you put it. It's very predictable. It's going to stay exactly where you want it. So why is this good to know? One reason why it is really good to know this is that if you want, like I said earlier, more of a looser watercolor look, those surfer colors are better for getting that particular look, because they are pretty much, you let the watercolor do its thing and you are there for the ride. You have almost no control when they are in that wet environment. Now, they're not going to jump the water and go onto a dry place on your paper. So wherever you put that water, you still have control of where that color would be located. But the actual paint and how it moves and how it decides to basically go out, that is completely up to the paint. With a surfer color, they do their own thing and you just let them go and you go, hi baby, go on. But if you have a sinker color, sinker colors are very predictable, like I said, but they're also really good for creating walls. So a lot of times when I am painting with a surfer color, such as Indian yellow, and I want to basically hold back a little bit, so basically control it a little bit, sinker colors are really good for creating walls to kind of hold those colors back. Now, the sinker color is not, it's still gonna move. So you still are not gonna have complete control. Whenever you're working with watercolor in a wet technique, you don't have that much control. But when you're working with a sinker color, it does give you a little bit of, I guess, a harness kind of to hold back a sinker color, a surfer color. So what ends up happening is if you put a sinker color down and kind of line it where you would want basically the wall to form, and I recommend kind of putting it in a little bit further than where you would want basically the color to go. That sinker color is going to sink into the paper where you've put it, and then you put your surfer color next to it, and the surfer color will punch into that sinker, but because it's hitting that sinker, it's actually going to slow it down so that it won't basically take over the entire wet on wet area. And what's really cool about this is the two colors usually mix really well and create this really unique basically dynamic, where sometimes you'll get these like spindlies coming out because sometimes this surfer color will actually break the sinker color up and create a little spindle to go out. So that's something to keep in mind when you're talking about mixability, especially in a wet on wet environment. And that is something that I have found over the years when working with watercolor paints. Hey y'all, Carrie here. So this is the last video of the watercolor paint tip series that I was doing. I had 3 more tips left for that series. I was planning on releasing them slowly and surely, but I just decided this week I'm gonna put them all together in this video and just release them all together. and just be done with it, because I have a pretty massive project actually that I've been working on, specifically with a watercolor journal, as well as some other projects that I've actually been working on for about a month now. And so I'm really excited. I have some really cool projects coming out and in the next couple of weeks, but I wanted to let you know I'm going to be taking next week off. So no video next week from me, because I want to get full force, full eyes onto this particular project and get it done. And kind of show you what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. So I'm working on a pretty massive project and I'm really excited about it. This is the first time I've actually been really excited about my art in a really long time. So I hope that it shows in my videos, because I've kind of just been in a really bad slump with my art for a really long time, to be perfectly honest, about a year or two. And I don't know, something just happened over the past couple of really months, where I just got this passion once again to work in my art, and I've been having really cool creative ideas. So I'm excited to share with you what I've been working on, but I'm going to give myself a little bit of a breather room because it's a pretty massive project that I'm currently working on. So I'm going to take next week off, and then I'll be back the next week. So make sure to stay tuned, and lots of love, y'all, and I will see you in a week.